The morning light filtered through the pale yellow curtains of Emma's bedroom, casting everything in a soft golden hue that matched the little girl's anxiety perfectly, beautiful on the surface but somehow suffocating underneath. She lay in bed, her 7-year-old body rigid beneath the quilted comforter her grandmother had made, listening to the sounds of the world waking up outside. A car drove past. A neighbor called to someone. A dog barked 3 blocks away. Each sound felt like it was happening directly inside her chest, reverberating through her small frame with a force that made her want to burrow deeper under the covers and never emerge. Emma Mitchell had learned very early in life that the world was too much, too loud, too bright, too unpredictable, too full of people who wanted things from her: eye contact, words, explanations, responses. They wanted her to be normal, whatever that meant. They wanted her to speak, to participate, to exist in the way that other children seemed to exist so effortlessly. But for Emma, existing itself felt like climbing a mountain while wearing a blindfold. By the age of 7, Emma had already collected a small library of diagnoses. Selective mutism, her therapist had said, writing the words in her neat handwriting in a folder that Emma's mother, Sarah, carried to every appointment like it contained the secrets to the universe. Anxiety disorder, possible trauma responses. The psychiatrist had prescribed medication that made Emma feel like she was moving through honey. Speech therapy had yielded minimal results. The therapist, a well-meaning woman named Mrs., would sit across from Emma for 45 minutes at a time, asking gentle questions that echoed unanswered into the silence between them. Sarah Mitchell was a woman slowly fracturing under the weight of her daughter's suffering. She was beautiful in that exhausted way that mothers of struggling children often are, her dark hair pulled back in a perpetual ponytail, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, lines around her mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Every night she lay awake, wondering what she had done wrong, what she had failed to do right. She wondered if it was the divorce from Emma's father, though the therapists assured her that wasn't uncommon. She wondered if something had happened that Emma couldn't or wouldn't tell her. She wondered if her daughter would ever speak freely, would ever feel comfortable enough in her own skin to simply say what she needed. Teachers complained constantly. Emma doesn't participate in class discussions. Emma won't present her project to the class. Emma struggles to make friends because she won't initiate conversation. The comments came home in report cards and during parent-teacher conferences. Sarah would nod politely, smile apologetically, and silently scream inside, as if she hadn't tried everything. As if she hadn't spent countless dollars on therapy and medication, time organizing special accommodations, energy trying to create safe spaces where Emma might feel comfortable enough to speak. The other children at Riverside Elementary School had learned to exist around Emma rather than with her. She was the quiet girl, the one who ate lunch alone or sat on the periphery of groups, listening but never joining. Some of the children whispered about her, made jokes about why she never talked. "Is she deaf?" one boy had asked once, loud enough for Emma to hear. "Maybe she's retarded," a girl had offered another day. Emma had simply sat very still, the way prey animals do when predators are near, hoping that if she made herself small enough, invisible enough, the cruelty would pass over her like a wave. Sarah had almost given up hope by the time she heard about the service dog program. It was mentioned casually by Dr. Emma's therapist over the phone one evening. "There's a specialized program," she had said, "that trains dogs to work with children who have anxiety disorders. The dogs provide deep pressure therapy, grounding techniques. Some of my clients have found them revolutionary." Sarah had been skeptical. A dog? How would a dog help? But she was desperate enough and Emma was suffering enough that she decided to try. She filled out applications. She wrote essays about her daughter's condition. She provided medical records and therapy notes and waited for 3 agonizing months. Then came the day that everything changed. Bailey arrived at their home on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. He was a pure golden retriever, 3 years old, with a coat that looked like honey and eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom beyond his years. The dog wore an official service vest, burgundy with gold letters spelling out "Service Dog." His handler, a kind woman named, explained everything in careful detail. How Bailey was trained to recognize signs of panic and anxiety. How he would apply deep pressure therapy by leaning his considerable weight against Emma's legs or lying across her lap. How he understood roughly 150 different commands and situations. Emma stood frozen in the living room, watching this beautiful creature who had somehow entered her carefully controlled world. Bailey approached her slowly, giving her space, respecting her boundaries in a way that humans rarely did. He didn't demand anything from her. He simply sat, positioned so that she could see him clearly, and looked at her with those soulful brown eyes. For the first time in years, Emma felt something shift in her chest, not the usual tight knot of anxiety, but something looser, something that felt almost like hope. Over the first week, Bailey didn't try to make Emma speak. Instead, he simply existed beside her. He lay his head on her lap while she ate breakfast. He walked beside her at school, causing a minor sensation that actually made other children approach her with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "What's the dog's name?" they asked. "What's he for?" For the first time, Emma had something to offer them, and she whispered answers so quiet they had to lean in to hear. By the end of the first month, Emma had started whispering to Bailey, long, rambling whispers about her feelings, her fears, the things that made her chest tight. Bailey listened with the absolute attention of a being who cared nothing about grammar or articulation, or whether what she said made perfect sense. He simply listened, present and steady and unconditionally accepting. Within 2 months, Emma's small world had expanded in ways no one could have predicted. She was speaking more, still quietly, still carefully, but more. The medication could be reduced. The therapy sessions showed measurable progress. Teachers sent home positive reports. And it was all because of this golden retriever who had somehow become the bridge between Emma's inner world and the larger world that terrified her. Bailey wasn't just a dog. He was Emma's translator, her shield, her best friend, and most importantly, he was proof that she wasn't alone, that she would never be truly alone again. It was a Thursday evening in September when Sarah first noticed the bruises. Emma was stepping out of the shower, and as she reached for her towel, Sarah caught sight of her daughter's upper left arm. Dark marks, the size and shape of fingers, bloomed across her pale skin like flowers that shouldn't exist. Sarah's heart stopped. She reached out slowly, as if moving too quickly might shatter something fragile. "Emma, baby, what happened here?" Sarah's voice was careful, controlled, though inside she felt like she was free-falling through darkness. Emma's entire body went rigid. Her eyes, which had been slowly learning to make contact with her mother's, immediately looked away. She pulled her arm close to her body and whispered something so quietly that Sarah couldn't hear. "I need you to tell me what happened," Sarah said, gentler now, kneeling to Emma's eye level. "Did someone hurt you?" Emma shook her head, but her lip trembled, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. Bailey, who had been lying on the bathroom mat, immediately stood and approached Emma, pressing his body against her legs with unusual urgency. The dog's response confirmed what Sarah's gut was already screaming. Something was very, very wrong. That night Sarah didn't sleep. She lay in bed, replaying every interaction from the past few weeks with new, horrifying eyes. She thought about the way Emma had become increasingly withdrawn after returning from her father's house every other weekend. She thought about the nightmares that had returned, vivid and terrifying, that jolted Emma awake at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat. She thought about how Emma's anxiety, which had been steadily improving with Bailey's presence, had suddenly spiked again, particularly before pickup days. The next morning, Sarah did what any responsible parent would do. She called her ex-husband, David Mitchell, as casually as she could manage. "Hey, I noticed Emma has some bruises on her arm. How did she get those?" There was a pause, then she fell. She was playing in the backyard and fell off the jungle gym. I took her to urgent care to get checked out. She's fine, no fractures or anything." Sarah's jaw clenched. Emma hadn't mentioned urgent care. Emma hadn't mentioned falling. And something in David's tone, too quick, too defensive, set off alarm bells that wouldn't stop ringing. "I'd like to have her checked by her own doctor," Sarah said carefully, "just to be sure." "Fine, whatever. You always think the worst of me anyway," he hung up. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah became a detective of her own daughter's body and behavior. She documented the bruises with photographs, noting dates and locations. She started a journal of Emma's nightmares, her regression in speech, her increasing fear. She noticed how Emma would flinch if David's name came up, how she would cling to Bailey with an intensity that broke Sarah's heart. Dr. Emma's pediatrician examined the bruises carefully and exchanged a meaningful look with Sarah when she described the circumstances. "These aren't consistent with a fall," the doctor said quietly. "The pattern and shape suggest manual pressure, fingers specifically, and the location is concerning." The doctor then spoke the words that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. "I'm required to file a report with Child Protective Services." The machinery of the legal system, once set in motion, seemed to move with devastating speed. Within 48 hours, a caseworker from CPS showed up at the school, pulling Emma out of class for an interview. Sarah wasn't allowed to be present. For 2 hours, she sat in the school office, her leg bouncing with anxiety, imagining all the ways Emma might shut down, might refuse to talk to this stranger, might not be able to articulate what had happened. When Emma emerged, she looked like she'd aged years. Her small face was blotchy from crying. Bailey was waiting at the classroom door, and Emma went directly to him, burying her face in his fur. The caseworker, a tired-looking woman named Detective, spoke to Sarah in the hallway. "Your daughter disclosed abuse," she said without preamble. "She stated that her father has touched her inappropriately on multiple occasions. She's been threatened into silence. We're opening a full investigation, and I'm recommending that all contact between your daughter and the father be suspended pending investigation results." Sarah felt the world tilt. She had suspected, yes, but hearing it confirmed aloud made it brutally, horrifyingly real. She pulled Emma into her arms right there in the school hallway, holding her daughter while she trembled. That afternoon, Sarah's phone rang. It was David's lawyer. "My client strenuously denies these allegations," a crisp female voice informed her. "He's filed a counter-report claiming you're coaching your daughter to make false accusations as part of a custody manipulation strategy. We're going to need the court to order a psychological evaluation." Sarah felt rage ignite in her chest, hot and consuming. The presumption, the audacity, the complete dismissal of her daughter's suffering. It was almost more than she could bear. But she had to bear it. Emma was depending on her. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life became consumed by the legal process. She met with lawyers who spoke in careful, measured tones about custody hearings, burden of proof, credibility assessments. She attended mandatory parenting classes and psychological evaluations. She documented everything, every bruise, every nightmare, every time Emma flinched or. David, through his lawyer, maintained complete innocence. He claimed Emma was confused, that Sarah had poisoned her mind against him. He suggested that Emma's anxiety disorder made her an unreliable witness, that she was prone to confabulation. He painted himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife's conspiracy. But Emma, supported by Bailey's constant presence, began showing subtle signs of healing. The dog had become attuned to her trauma in ways that seemed almost supernatural. When Emma woke screaming from nightmares, Bailey was there, providing deep pressure therapy, grounding her to the present moment. When anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, Bailey sensed it and responded before Emma even consciously recognized it. One evening, about a month into the investigation, Emma sat on the couch with her head on Bailey's back, her fingers buried in his golden fur. Sarah watched her daughter and realized something profound. Whatever happened in the courtroom, whatever the judge decided, Emma had already begun the journey toward healing. She had Bailey. She had her mother's unwavering belief in her. She had spoken her truth, and that truth, once voiced, couldn't be unspoken. "We're going to get through this," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Emma. Emma looked up at her mother, then down at Bailey, and for the first time in weeks she whispered a single word: together. It was a word that contained everything: fear, hope, resilience, and the fragile belief that somehow, some way, justice might actually prevail. The lawyer called the next day with news of the court date. In 3 months, they would stand before a judge. Emma would have to testify. The real battle was about to begin. The courthouse was closed on Saturday mornings, which meant it was the perfect time for Emma to become familiar with the place where her life would be decided. Sarah had explained this to the judge's chamber, and remarkably, they had agreed to allow a pre-trial visit. Dr. Emma's therapist walked beside the 8-year-old girl as they moved through the empty corridors. Bailey's claws clicked softly against the marble floors, the sound echoing in the silence. Emma's small hand gripped Doctor's fingers so tightly that the therapist could feel the trembling in the child's entire arm. They hadn't told Emma about the courthouse visit until that morning, worried that too much anticipatory anxiety would be counterproductive. But even without warning, Emma's body knew something significant was happening. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes darted around the hallway, taking in every detail with the hypervigilance of a trauma survivor. "This is where you'll come on the day of the trial," Doctor explained gently, keeping her voice soft and steady. "There's nothing scary here when it's empty like this. It's just a building. A big, important building, but a building nonetheless." They approached the courtroom doors. Sarah, who had been given special permission to observe this session, held her breath. Would Emma shut down? Would she regress? Instead, Emma did something unexpected. She looked down at Bailey and whispered, "Stay with me." The question nearly broke Sarah's heart. Even as an 8-year-old, Emma understood that the real challenge wouldn't be the building or the people or the formal procedures. The real challenge would be staying present, staying grounded, staying connected to her own voice when everything in her wanted to disappear into silence. "Bailey can be with you," Doctor confirmed. "He'll be right beside you the whole time." They entered the courtroom and Emma gasped. It was massive. The ceiling soared impossibly high. The judge's bench loomed like a throne. The empty gallery seats seemed to multiply in her mind, each one filled with judging eyes. Emma felt the familiar sensation of panic beginning to rise in her chest, that tightening, that suffocation, that desperate urge to become invisible. That's when Bailey did something extraordinary. The dog pressed his entire body against Emma's legs, applying what's called deep pressure therapy. The weight, the warmth, the solid reality of him seemed to anchor Emma to the present moment. Her breathing slowed. Her heart stopped racing quite so frantically. Bailey wasn't asking her to be brave. He was simply reminding her that she wasn't alone. Over the next several weeks, these Saturday visits became rituals. Emma would visit the courtroom, and each time she would practice sitting in the witness stand. Doctor would ask her questions, starting gently, then gradually increasing in difficulty. The questions mimicked what would happen in the real trial. "Where were you when this happened?" Doctor would ask, her voice gentle but purposeful. Emma would hesitate, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then she would reach down and touch a specific spot behind Bailey's ear, a soft, gentle gesture that only she and the dog understood. Bailey would respond immediately, repositioning himself, sometimes lying his head on her lap, sometimes pressing his full weight against her leg. And with his grounding presence, Emma would find the words. It was Doctor who had suggested the signal, actually. "We need something that only you and Bailey understand," she had told Emma. "Something that gives you control in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. Something that tells Bailey, 'I need you now,' without you having to say it out loud." Emma had chosen the spot behind Bailey's ear almost immediately. It was a place she touched during their quiet times together, when the world was too much and she needed grounding. It was a place that felt like belonging. During the day, In Emma's regular therapy sessions, Doctor worked on helping her understand the power of her own voice. They did role-playing exercises. They practiced breathing techniques. They discussed what questions might be asked and how Emma could answer them honestly without overwhelming herself with shame or fear. "The abuse was not your fault," Doctor would say again and again. "You did nothing wrong. You're not bad. You're not broken. You're a brave girl who experienced something terrible and now you're going to tell the truth about it. That takes courage." Sarah attended every session, watching her daughter slowly prepare for something that should never be asked of an 8-year-old. The attorney handling the case, a woman named, also began visiting. Ms. was warm but direct, and she specialized in child testimony. She had a way of making everything feel less terrifying. "The judge just wants to hear what happened from you," Ms. explained during one session. "He wants to hear it in your own words in your own time. If you need to take a break, you can ask for one. If you don't understand a question, you can say so. You're in control here." But Emma didn't feel in control. Not really. The courtroom, even empty, felt like a place designed to strip control away from children. The formality, the authority, the power dynamics, they all worked against her. Then came the night, 2 weeks before the trial, when everything shifted. Emma was in bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Bailey lay across her lap, his weight comforting. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, reading a book about trauma-informed parenting, though honestly, at this point, she felt like she was just holding on by a thread. Emma reached down and touched the spot behind Bailey's ear, the signal, even though they weren't in a therapy session, even though no one was asking her difficult questions. "Mama," Emma whispered. "Yes, baby." Sarah set down her book immediately, giving Emma her full attention. What if I can't talk? In the courtroom, what if my voice breaks?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Then you tell the truth as best you can, even if it comes out in pieces, even if it comes out in whispers. The judge will listen." "But Daddy says nobody will believe me. He says." Emma's voice trailed off, unable to continue. Sarah reached over and touched the same spot on Bailey's ear that Emma had just touched. The dog's tail wagged slightly, as if acknowledging this moment of connection between all three of them. "Your daddy was wrong about a lot of things," Sarah said carefully, "but he's especially wrong about this. People will believe you because the truth has a particular sound. It sounds like someone who is trying really hard to be brave. It sounds like someone who matters. And you matter, Emma. You matter so much." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "If Bailey is with me, I can do it." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "If Bailey is with you, you can do it. And I'll be there too. And all the people who love you will be rooting for you." Emma reached back down and touched Bailey's ear again. Practice, reinforcement, the building of a neural pathway that would carry her through the most difficult moment of her young life. Each time she touched that spot, her brain learned, "I am safe. I am grounded. I am not alone. I can do this." By the time the trial date arrived, the signal had become as natural to Emma as breathing. It was her invisible lifeline, her secret language with the only being in that courtroom who asked nothing of her except her truth. Emma woke at 4:30 in the morning, which was 3 hours before her alarm, her heart already racing as if she'd been running for miles. For a moment, she lay in the darkness of her bedroom, disoriented, unable to remember why anxiety was already churning in her small stomach. Then it came back to her, crashing over her like a wave. Today was the day. The courtroom, the judge, her father, the questions that would force her to speak the truth out loud in front of people she didn't know. She reached over in the darkness and felt for Bailey. The dog was already awake, his dark eyes open and alert, as if he too had been waiting for this moment. Somehow Bailey always knew. Even though Sarah had said nothing to him about the significance of this day, the dog seemed to understand on some cellular level that today was different, important, terrifying. Emma's hand found the familiar spot behind Bailey's ear, and she touched it gently. Not out of panic, not yet, but as a way of saying good morning to her best friend. Bailey's tail thumped softly against the mattress, and he shifted closer to her, his warm body providing comfort through the darkness. Downstairs, Sarah was already awake, moving through the kitchen like a ghost, preparing coffee she wouldn't drink. She was dressed in her best suit, navy blue, professional, the kind of outfit designed to convey trustworthiness and stability. Her hair was done. Her makeup was careful. She looked like a woman who had everything under control, which was a lie. Inside, Sarah felt like she was coming apart at the seams. She had barely slept. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, rehearsing conversations in her head, preparing responses to questions she couldn't predict, running through worst-case scenarios. What if Emma froze on the stand? What if the defense attorney was too aggressive? What if the judge sided with David? What if? When Emma appeared at the bottom of the stairs, still in her pajamas, Sarah's heart clenched. Her daughter looked so small, so fragile, like she might blow away if someone opened a window too hard. Bailey followed close behind, and Sarah was grateful for his presence in a way that words couldn't quite express. "Good morning, baby," Sarah said softly, pulling Emma into her arms. "How are you feeling?" Emma didn't answer verbally. Instead, she buried her face in her mother's shoulder and held on like she was drowning. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes but forced them back. Emma needed her to be strong. Emma needed her to be a rock. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Emma picked at toast that Sarah had spread with honey, took a few sips of orange juice, then pushed the plate away. Her stomach was too knotted for food. Sarah didn't push. She simply held her daughter's hand across the table while Bailey rested his head on Emma's lap, sensing her distress. By 8 o'clock, both mother and daughter were bathed and dressed. Sarah had let Emma choose her own outfit, and the girl had selected a lavender dress with tiny embroidered flowers, the same one she'd worn to every therapy session for the past 2 months. It was her armor. It was soft and pretty and made her feel slightly less terrified. She pulled her hair back into a neat braid that Sarah fixed with a white ribbon, and for a moment she looked like a normal 8-year-old preparing for a normal day. But they both knew nothing about this day was normal. Bailey was groomed and pristine, his service dog vest placed carefully over his shoulders. The burgundy vest with its official patches seemed to give him a different kind of presence, more authoritative, more protective. Emma watched him get dressed for the courtroom and felt a strange sense of comfort. Bailey was going to the courtroom too. She wasn't going alone. The car ride to the courthouse was silent except for the soft sound of the radio playing instrumental music that Sarah had chosen specifically because it was calming. Emma sat in the back seat, her hand on Bailey's head, touching that familiar spot behind his ear every few minutes. Practice, reassurance, preparation. The signal had become such a constant part of her coping mechanism that she sometimes did it without even conscious awareness. Sarah checked her watch obsessively. They were early, too early, but she'd rather wait outside the courthouse than sit in traffic, spiraling deeper into anxiety. She found a parking spot and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved to get out of the car. "Your therapist will be inside," Sarah said, her voice carefully steady. "Ms. will be there. The judge is a good man, Emma. He wants to hear your truth." Emma nodded slightly, but she didn't look convinced. She was staring out the window at the courthouse steps, which seemed to stretch endlessly upward like the entrance to some ancient temple. The building was made of pale limestone and looked simultaneously majestic and terrifying. "And I'll be in the courtroom," Sarah continued. "I'll be right there where you can see me, and Bailey will be with you." "What if I can't?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if I forget how to talk?" Sarah turned around in her seat to face her daughter directly. She reached back and took Emma's small hands in hers. "Then you don't talk. Then you point or nod or cry or do whatever your body needs to do. But I don't think you'll forget, Emma. I think you're braver than you know. I think you've been preparing for this your whole life, And today is the day you show everyone else what I already know, that you're extraordinary." Emma's lip trembled, and she squeezed her mother's hands. Then she looked down at Bailey and touched the spot behind his ear one more time. At 9 o'clock, they got out of the car. The autumn morning was crisp and bright, the kind of beautiful day that seemed obscene given the circumstances. Sarah held Emma's hand as they climbed the courthouse steps, one slow step at a time. Emma's other hand was buried in Bailey's collar. The dog walked with the dignified bearing of a warrior heading into battle. As they reached the top of the steps and approached the courthouse doors, Emma looked back at the world she was leaving behind. The parking lot, the street, the normal life where people went about their days unaware that inside this building, an 8-year-old girl was about to stand up and fight for her own survival. "Ready?" Sarah asked, squeezing her daughter's hand. Emma took a shaky breath and whispered, "Bailey's with me." "Yes, baby, Bailey's with you, and so am I." They pushed through the courthouse doors and everything changed. The courtroom doors swung shut behind them with a decisive click that sounded like a guillotine blade falling. Emma's entire body went rigid. The space was exactly as it had been during all those Saturday practice sessions, yet somehow vastly different. This time, every seat in the gallery was filled. This time, the judge wasn't a kind man asking gentle questions. He was justice itself, imposing and absolute. This time her father was there, sitting at a table with his lawyer, his face twisted with barely concealed rage. Emma's eyes found her father's across the courtroom, and she felt the familiar paralysis begin to creep through her limbs. He smiled at her, not a warm smile, but a smile that contained a threat, a reminder, a warning, the smile of a man who believed he could intimidate an 8-year-old into silence. Bailey seemed to sense the shift in Emma's energy. The dog pressed his body closer to hers, a subtle reminder of his presence. Sarah squeezed Emma's shoulder as they were directed toward the witness stand. An elderly bailiff, his face kind but official, guided Emma to the chair that had been specially prepared for her testimony. It was elevated slightly, so she was at eye level with the judge, but Emma felt like she was being placed on a stage before an invisible audience. The bailiff placed a hand on a Bible and began the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Emma opened her mouth. No sound came out. She tried again, still nothing. Her throat was completely closed off, her body staging a rebellion that her conscious mind couldn't control. "It's okay," the bailiff said gently. "Just nod if you agree." Emma nodded, and the oath was complete. She was now officially testifying in a court of law. The prosecutor, a woman named Ms., approached the stand with a warm smile. Her questions started easily, designed to help Emma acclimate to speaking in such a formal setting. "Can you tell me your name?" "Emma," came the whisper, barely audible. "And how old are you, Emma?" 8. The questions continued, each one carefully calibrated to build Emma's confidence. Where did she go to school? What was her favorite subject? These were softball questions, designed to establish that Emma was capable of answering questions, that her testimony had credibility. Emma's voice grew slightly stronger as she answered. She wasn't in the witness stand talking about abuse yet. She was just being herself, answering simple questions. Bailey lay with his head resting on the edge of the stand, his body language conveying absolute faith in her ability to do this. Then the defense attorney stood up. His name was Robert Caldwell, and he was everything Ms. was not. He was aggressive, dismissive, and he approached the stand like a predator approaching prey. His first question was deceptively simple. "Emma, isn't it true that your mother has told you several times that you need to tell people what your father did?" "No," Emma whispered. "Speak up, please. The court reporter can't hear you." "No," Emma said again, slightly louder, but her hands were beginning to tremble. "Your mother has a history of making false accusations, doesn't she? Didn't she accuse your father of infidelity when there was no evidence?" Ms. stood up immediately. Objection, badgering. The judge sustained the objection, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Caldwell's approach was working. He was making the questions about Emma's reliability, about her mother's vindictiveness, about whether Emma could truly distinguish between what really happened and what she'd been told happened. Emma felt the panic beginning to rise. Her breathing became shallow. Her vision started to tunnel. The courtroom, which had been manageable moments before, suddenly felt like a trap closing around her. She could feel her mind beginning to dissociate, to retreat into that familiar place of silence where nothing could touch her. "Isn't it possible," Caldwell continued, "that you're confused about what happened, that you've mixed up normal physical contact with something inappropriate?" Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She tried again. Nothing. The silence was descending, that familiar numbness that meant she was about to disappear. This was it. This was the moment everything could fall apart. That's when Emma did it. With fingers that trembled with the effort, she reached over the edge of the witness stand to where Bailey was positioned. She found the spot behind his ear, their spot, their signal, their secret language, and she touched it. The effect was immediate and profound. Bailey stood up, his entire body shifting into action with the precision of the highly trained service animal he was. He moved to position himself directly beneath the witness stand, and then, in a move that had been practiced hundreds of times but never with such monumental stakes, he stood up on his hind legs and placed his front paws on the edge of the stand, his body creating a physical barrier between Emma and the rest of the courtroom. His head pressed gently against Emma's chest, applying the deep pressure therapy that his training had taught him to provide in moments of extreme anxiety. The courtroom went silent. Every single person in that room seemed to hold their breath. Emma felt Bailey's weight against her, felt the reality of his presence, felt the absolute certainty that she was not alone. The dog's heartbeat, steady, strong, unwavering, seemed to synchronize with her own panicked rhythm, slowly bringing it back to normal. She took a breath, then another, and then, with Bailey's body literally supporting her, holding her up, Emma's voice returned. "Yes," she said, not a whisper but an actual word. "He touched me in places he shouldn't have, on my private parts, and he told me that if I told anyone he would hurt my dog, he would hurt Bailey." The defense attorney's face went pale. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the dog to physically manifest Emma's courage. He hadn't expected that with Bailey's support, Emma would find the strength to not just answer his question, but to provide the most damning detail of all, the threat against the dog that had kept her silent. The judge leaned forward, his expression shifting from neutral to deeply concerned. Ms. Face showed a mixture of shock and validation. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter, her brave, terrified, extraordinary daughter, speak her truth out loud. Bailey remained in position, his paws on the stand, his body pressed against Emma's, for the entire remainder of the testimony. And with each subsequent question, Emma found her voice a little stronger. The signal had done something more than just calm her anxiety. It had fundamentally shifted the power dynamic in that courtroom. Emma was no longer a victim being questioned. She was a child bearing witness to her own truth, supported by love in its form and nothing, not an aggressive attorney, not a courtroom full of strangers, not even the trauma itself, could silence her again. Ms. seized the moment. With gentle precision, she guided Emma deeper into her testimony. "Emma, can you tell us about the first time this happened? Where were you?" Emma's hand found the spot behind Bailey's ear again, not out of panic this time, but out of a need for connection, for grounding, for the reminder that she was safe enough to speak the unspeakable. Bailey remained in his position, his paws on the stand, his body a living bridge between Emma's inner world and the outer courtroom. "I was at Daddy's house," Emma began, her voice growing slightly stronger with each word. "It was after dinner. Mom had just dropped me off." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers seemed to pause over her keyboard, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "He told me to come to his bedroom," Emma continued. "He said he wanted to show me something. I didn't want to go, but he was angry when I didn't listen." "How did you know he was angry?" Ms. asked. "His face got red, his voice got really loud, and he grabbed my arm." Emma glanced down at her own arm as if she could still feel the grip of her father's hand. It hurt. In the gallery, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She had seen those bruises. She had documented them. But hearing Emma describe how they happened made it viscerally, undeniably real in a way that photographs never could. "What happened when you went to his bedroom?" Ms. asked carefully. Emma's whole body trembled. Her hand moved to Bailey's ear again, a stronger touch this time. Bailey responded by pushing his body more firmly against her, as if he was saying, "I'm right here. You're not alone in this." "He told me to sit on the bed," Emma whispered, "and he took off my clothes." Several people in the gallery gasped. A woman in the second row wiped away tears. The judge's expression hardened into something unforgiving. "How did that make you feel?" Ms. asked. "Scared," Emma said, then with more force, "bad, dirty, like it was my fault somehow, even though I knew inside that it wasn't right." "Why do you think you felt like it was your fault?" "Because he kept saying it was our secret, that it was what daddies and daughters do, that I should like it. And when I cried, he got angry and said I was ungrateful. He said if I told anyone, if I told Mommy or my teacher or Bailey, he would hurt Bailey. He said he would take Bailey away and nobody would ever see him again." The statement hung in the courtroom like a physical object. The threat against Bailey, this had been the mechanism of silence. This had been why Emma hadn't told anyone for months, why she had internalized the abuse as something she needed to keep secret, why her anxiety had spiraled into selective mutism. The defense attorney, Robert Caldwell, stood up. He was visibly shaken by the specificity of Emma's testimony, but he attempted to maintain his aggressive posture. "Isn't it possible that you're confusing a traumatic memory with something that didn't happen? Children have very active imaginations." "Objection," Ms. called out immediately, badgering and argumentative. "Sustained," the judge said sharply. "Mr. Caldwell, confine yourself to appropriate cross-examination." But Caldwell pressed on, trying a different angle. "Your father says he took you to urgent care after you fell. Do you remember that?" Emma touched Bailey's ear. "Yes." "And the doctor found nothing wrong with you?" "He said I had some bruises, but nothing broken." "So isn't it possible that's where the bruises came from, the fall?" Emma shook her head emphatically. "I didn't fall. He hurt me. And then he said if I told anyone what happened, he would hurt Bailey." The repetition of this threat was not accidental. Emma was drilling it into the courtroom's consciousness. This was what had kept her silent. This was the mechanism of control that her abuser had used. One of the court officers, a large man with a weathered face, had tears streaming down his cheeks. He was watching a child, barely 8 years old, recount her own abuse with the kind of honesty that most adults could never achieve. The raw authenticity of her testimony, the way she stumbled over certain words, the way she would pause and touch Bailey's ear to ground herself, the way her voice would break and then strengthen again, all of it combined to create an undeniable picture of truth. "How many times did this happen?" Ms. asked gently. Emma was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved to Bailey's ear. The dog made a small sound, almost like he was encouraging her, supporting her. "I don't know exactly," Emma said finally. "A lot. Maybe 5 times, 6 times. I tried not to count because counting made it more real." "And this continued until when?" "Until my mom noticed the bruises and asked my teacher. And then the teacher told someone else. And then the police came." Ms. nodded slowly. "Emma, I know this is difficult, but I want you to know that you've been very brave today. You've told the truth, and that takes incredible courage." Emma's bottom lip trembled. For the first time during her testimony, she looked like what she was, a traumatized child who had just relived some of the worst moments of her life in front of a courtroom full of strangers. But she was still speaking. She was still here. She hadn't retreated into silence. Bailey seemed to sense the shift. The dog lowered himself slightly, his body still pressed against Emma, but in a less intense way, as if allowing her to exist in her grief for a moment. "Does Bailey help you feel safe?" Ms. asked, and there was something almost sacred in the question. Emma looked down at her dog, and for the first time since beginning her testimony, a small smile appeared on her face. It was heartbreaking and hopeful all at once. "Yes," she said, "Bailey keeps me safe. He knows when I'm scared. He doesn't make me talk if I don't want to. He's there, and that makes everything easier." The prosecutor glanced at the judge, and there was understanding between them. This was enough. Emma had said what she needed to say. Pushing for more details would only cause additional trauma. "Your Honor, I have no further questions," Ms. said. As she walked back to her seat, she passed Sarah and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The message was clear. Your daughter did an extraordinary thing today. The defense attorney attempted more cross-examination, trying to poke holes in Emma's story, to suggest that she was confused or manipulated. But with Bailey's constant presence, with the signal that had become as automatic as breathing, Emma stood firm. She didn't contradict herself. She didn't become flustered or unsure. She simply told the truth, over and over again, in response to increasingly hostile questioning. By the end of it, even the most hardened observers in the courtroom understood something fundamental. This child was telling the truth. Not because she was perfect in her testimony, but precisely because of her imperfections. The halting way she spoke about painful things, the way she had to ground herself with her dog, the way her voice would sometimes break but always reformed. When the judge finally called for a recess, Emma was allowed to leave the witness stand. Bailey immediately repositioned himself, his body supporting her weight as she walked on shaky legs back toward her mother. As she passed her father's table, Emma felt Bailey press closer to her leg. A protection, a boundary, an assertion that this child belonged to the world of love and safety, not the world of shame and control. Sarah pulled her daughter into her arms, and for the first time that day, Emma allowed herself to cry. The courtroom had emptied during the recess. Emma sat in a small room just off the main courtroom, surrounded by support, Doctor on one side, her mother on the other, and Bailey resting his head on her lap. The girl's hands shook as she stroked his golden fur, each touch grounding her, reminding her that she had survived something monumental. She had spoken her truth, and she was still alive. She was still safe. "You did incredible things today," Doctor said softly. "Do you know that?" Emma shook her head. She didn't feel incredible. She felt hollowed out, like someone had taken everything inside her and poured it out onto the courtroom floor. "You told the truth," Sarah said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Even when it was scary, even when a mean man was trying to confuse you, you stood strong." An hour later, they were called back into the courtroom. The gallery had refilled with people, reporters, advocates, concerned citizens who had heard about the case. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Judge William Harrison was a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough human suffering to have become both compassionate and absolutely uncompromising about justice. David Mitchell stood beside his attorney, his face a mask of false confidence, though his lawyer looked distinctly uncomfortable. The evidence presented by Emma's testimony, combined with medical documentation, psychological evaluations, and the testimony of her teacher and the school counselor, painted a clear picture. "This court has reviewed all evidence presented," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I have listened to the testimony of Emma Mitchell. I have reviewed medical records documenting bruising consistent with abuse. I have considered psychological evaluations indicating trauma responses consistent with sexual abuse. I have heard from mandated reporters. And based on the totality of the evidence, this court finds the allegations of child sexual abuse by the respondent, David Mitchell, to be credible and substantiated. Emma felt Sarah's hand tighten around hers. Bailey's tail, which had been still, began to move slightly, as if he sensed the shift in the emotional climate of the room. The court is deeply troubled by the testimony of a child who has been placed in the unconscionable position of having to defend her own safety and bodily autonomy. The judge continued, I have observed the relationship between this child and her service dog, and I must say that I have rarely witnessed such a profound example of an animal's capacity to support a human being through trauma. The judge paused, looking directly at Emma. His expression was not unkind, but it was serious. Emma, your courage today has been extraordinary. This court believes you, and this court is going to make sure that you are protected. Emma felt something inside her shift, something that had been locked tight for so long that she'd almost forgotten it could move. A sob rose in her throat. Therefore, the judge continued, I am ordering the following. Custody of Emma Mitchell is awarded solely and exclusively to her mother, Sarah Mitchell. David Mitchell is permitted supervised visitation only, contingent upon successful completion of a psychological evaluation and sex offender treatment program. He is to have no unsupervised contact with the minor child. A protective order is hereby issued, effective immediately. The judge's gavel came down with a sound like thunder. For a moment the courtroom was completely silent. Then Sarah made a sound, not quite a word, but an exhale of relief so profound it was almost a prayer being answered. She pulled Emma into her arms, and suddenly the girl's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. Emma collapsed into her mother's embrace and sobbed, real, heaving, body-racking sobs that seemed to release years of trapped fear and pain. All the terror of the courtroom, all the weight of speaking about unspeakable things, all the trauma she had been carrying alone for months, it poured out of her in waves. Bailey responded immediately. The dog stood up on his hind legs again, placing his paws on both Sarah and Emma, creating a circle of protection around them. It was as if he understood that this moment required his full presence, his complete engagement, his absolute commitment to being there for this child who had trusted him with everything. The bailiff approached, offering tissues. The court reporter sat motionless at her station, tears streaming down her face. Even the judge, typically a study in judicial composure, allowed a small, satisfied nod to cross his features. David Mitchell's face had turned a furious shade of purple. This is bullshit, he screamed, lunging towards Sarah and Emma. You poisoned her, you made her. Two bailiffs immediately moved toward him, restraining him as he continued to rage. You're going to regret this, both of you. I'll appeal. I'll fight this. Nobody takes away my daughter. Remove him from the courtroom, Judge Harrison said calmly, as if dealing with this tantrum was simply part of the day's business. And inform his counsel that any further outbursts will result in contempt charges. As David was physically escorted from the courtroom by the bailiffs, still raging about conspiracy and injustice, Emma buried her face deeper in Bailey's fur. The dog had positioned himself so that the child could hide in his presence, could shield herself from the sight of her abuser's rage. Sarah whispered over and over, It's okay. It's okay, it's over, you're safe. You did it, baby, you're safe. Ms. approached them, her own eyes glistening with tears. He'll appeal, she said quietly, but the evidence is overwhelming. The court found him credible. You won. Emma, you won. We won, Sarah corrected, and she extended her hand to the lawyer. We won because you believed in her, because you fought for her. As they stood to leave the courtroom, people began to stand as well. First one person, then another, until the entire gallery was standing in a silent show of solidarity. There were no words spoken, but the message was clear. We see you. We believe you. We honor your courage." Emma looked up at the standing people and something shifted in her expression. For months, she had felt like the victim of a crime. But standing here, supported by her mother and her dog and an entire courtroom full of people who believed in her, she felt something different. She felt like a survivor. She felt like someone whose truth had mattered. She felt like she had power. As they walked toward the courtroom doors, Emma reached down and touched the spot behind Bailey's ear one more time, not out of desperation or fear, but out of gratitude. Bailey's tail wagged, and he walked beside her with the dignified bearing of a soldier who had fought a battle alongside his companion and emerged victorious. Outside the courthouse, on the steps where Emma had been so terrified just hours earlier, the three of them stood in the autumn sunlight. Sarah turned to her daughter and asked, "How are you feeling?" Emma looked down at Bailey, touched the signal spot one final time and said clearly, "Safe." It was a single word, but it contained everything. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The end of silence and the beginning of voice. The end of victimization and the beginning of survival. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a monument to justice, and in front of them stretched a future full of possibility. 3 months after the verdict, Emma stood in front of her third-grade class, her hands trembling slightly as she held a poster board decorated with drawings of Bailey. The butterflies in her stomach were still there. She didn't know if they would ever completely go away. But now she understood something crucial. Butterflies didn't mean she couldn't do something. They just meant it mattered. "This is Bailey," she announced to her classmates, her voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the classroom. "He's a service dog, and he's the reason I'm standing here talking to you today." 3 months ago, this scene would have been impossible. 3 months ago, Emma couldn't have spoken in front of 5 people, let alone 25. But 3 months of healing, 3 months of therapy with doctor, 3 months of living with her mother in a home where she felt safe, had transformed her in ways that seemed almost miraculous. She told her classmates about selective mutism, about anxiety, about trauma. She explained what a service dog was and how deep pressure therapy worked. She talked about the spot behind Bailey's ear, their signal, and how sometimes when you're scared, you need a very small, very specific thing to remind you that you're safe. "Bailey didn't make my feelings go away," Emma explained, running her hand down Bailey's back as the dog sat patiently beside her. "But he made it so I wasn't alone with them, and that made all the difference." When Emma finished, the classroom was quiet for a moment. Then a boy named, who usually talked incessantly about video games, raised his hand. "Can you teach me the signal?" he asked quietly. Emma's eyes widened. "Why?" "Because I get scared too sometimes, and I think it would be nice to have something like that." After class, 5 other children approached Emma. 5 other children who had their own secrets, their own fears, their own reasons for keeping quiet. 5 other children who suddenly understood that they didn't have to carry their burdens alone. With doctor's help and her teacher's support, Emma started something that would become the Quiet Kids Club. It wasn't an official school organization, not at first. It was just a group of children who met in the library on Tuesday afternoons, and Bailey was always there. Some of the children had anxiety disorders. Some had experienced trauma. Some had social anxiety so severe that they struggled to speak in normal circumstances. Emma taught them the signal. She taught them what it felt like to have something so small, a touch, a gesture, a connection, that could mean the difference between silence and voice. By mid-spring, the Quiet Kids Club had 12 members. They didn't talk much when they met, but they sat together, and several of them had even brought their own pets, a hamster, a guinea pig, a rabbit. The message was the same. You're not alone. Your feelings matter. Your story matters. One afternoon, asked Emma a question. "Do you think your dad ever finds out that you're doing okay without him?" Emma was quiet for a moment, her hand on Bailey's head. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I don't think it matters as much anymore. What matters is that I know I'm okay, that my mom knows I'm okay, and that's enough. At home, things had changed too. Sarah had filed for a protective order that prevented David from showing up at Emma's school or home. His supervised visits had been scheduled to begin, but his attorney had advised him that attempting any visits might be used against him in the appeal process. So for now, Emma was free from the physical presence of her abuser. But the psychological impact didn't disappear overnight. Emma still had nightmares sometimes. She still flinched at certain sounds or touches. Healing wasn't linear. There were good days and hard days, progress and setbacks. On the hard days, Bailey was there. On the days when Emma woke up screaming from nightmares about her father, Bailey would move into her bed and provide deep pressure therapy. On the days when anxiety threatened to overwhelm her at school, she could touch the signal spot behind his ear and feel grounded. On the days when she wanted to retreat back into silence, Bailey would look at her with those soulful brown eyes and gently nudge her forward. Sarah had started her own journey of healing too. She attended a support group for parents of abused children, where she learned that she wasn't alone in her guilt, her rage, her trauma from witnessing her daughter's abuse. She learned that healing wasn't just Emma's responsibility, it was a family process. "I'm proud of you every single day," Sarah told Emma one evening as they sat together on the porch, Bailey at their feet. "I'm proud of the brave girl you are, but I also want you to know that it's okay to not be brave sometimes. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to need help." "I know," Emma said quietly. "Bailey taught me that." That summer, something unexpected happened. A journalist had heard about Emma's case and wanted to write a story about her testimony, about the role of service dogs in trauma recovery, about a little girl who had found her voice. Emma's therapist encouraged her to consider it. Sarah was hesitant but supportive. "It's your choice," she told her daughter. "You don't owe your story to anyone, but if you want to tell it, people need to hear it. There are other kids like you, Emma, kids who are suffering in silence. Your story might help them understand that they're not alone." Emma looked down at Bailey and touched the signal spot. The dog looked up at her with absolute faith, absolute trust in her decision. "Okay," Emma said, "I'll do it." The article came out in a parenting magazine and online, complete with photographs of Emma and Bailey. Within weeks, the article had been shared thousands of times. Sarah's inbox filled with messages from parents, teachers, and trauma survivors who had been moved by Emma's story. One message came from a woman named, whose granddaughter had experienced similar abuse and had completely shut down emotionally. After reading about Emma, wrote, "I looked into service dogs for my granddaughter. Thank you for saving my granddaughter's life by sharing your story." There were messages from teachers asking how to recognize signs of abuse in their students. There were messages from other children with selective mutism describing how reading about Emma had given them hope. There were messages from survivors of sexual abuse saying that Emma's courage had helped them find their own voices and come forward. Emma read every message. Some of them made her cry. Some of them made her realize something profound. Her pain had been transformed into something meaningful. Her suffering hadn't been for nothing. By speaking her truth, she had created a ripple effect that was touching lives she would never meet. One evening, as the sun was setting over their peaceful neighborhood, Emma sat on the front steps with Bailey. She was no longer the silent girl who had arrived at school unable to speak. She was no longer the terrified child in the courtroom, searching desperately for the courage to testify. She was a survivor, she was a voice, she was hope. "Bailey," she said, running her fingers through his golden fur, "thank you for being my best friend. Thank you for helping me find my voice." Bailey leaned his head against her shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer born from fear, but from peace. Inside the house, Sarah watched her daughter and her dog through the window. She thought about how far they had come, about the journey from that terrible day when she'd noticed the bruises to this moment of quiet contentment. She thought about the strength her daughter had discovered within herself, the courage that had always been there but needed support to emerge. She thought about justice and healing and the transformative power of being believed. And she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the golden dog, who had given her daughter wings when she needed them most. The courtroom had been the beginning of Emma's healing journey, but it was not the end. The end was still being written, one day at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one signal behind Bailey's ear at a time. And it was beautiful.